In the fading light of a forgotten southern town, the county fairground echoed with murmurs, creaking chairs, and the hollow ring of a rusted auctioneer's bell. Beneath the yellow flicker of old fluorescent lights, a German shepherd lay on the cracked concrete floor, silent, unmoving, and broken. His coat was patchy, scarred in places no animal should be, ribs pushing through his dull fur like old bones trying to escape. His eyes, those deep, amber eyes, were vacant, not wild or angry, just vacant. The auctioneer's voice cracked out above the low rumble of disinterest. Lot 42. No known history. Aggressive. Last chance before he's put down. Starting at 50. Laughter rippled through the crowd, soft and cruel. Not worth the gas it took to bring him here, someone muttered. But in the far corner, leaning on the wooden post near the exit sign, stood a man whose silence felt heavier than any noise in the room. Luke Carter, 29, ex-firefighter, hands still calloused from the firehouse he hadn't seen in 2 years, stepped forward. His face was tired in a way youth shouldn't look tired. No drama, no fanfare, just a quiet raising of his hand. The room turned. Even the auctioneer paused. "You serious, son?" Luke nodded once. He wasn't looking at the people or the price. He was looking at the dog. Or maybe at himself. Because something in those lifeless eyes mirrored his own. The same kind of emptiness that followed grief, guilt, and memories that couldn't be put out like flames. The auctioneer shrugged and slammed the gavel. Sold. $50. No refunds. A worn leather leash was handed over like it was scrap. The dog didn't lift his head. Didn't move. They said his name was Zero, but that wasn't a name, it was a sentence. Luke crouched down a few feet away, not reaching, just talking. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, voice gravelly. "I'm not here to hurt you. I don't even know if I can help you. But maybe we can just be broken together for a while." The shepherd's ear twitched. Barely. But it did. A couple of men scoffed from the back, one spitting tobacco into a paper cup. "You just bought a ticking time bomb, son." Luke stood slowly, never taking his eyes off the dog. "Yeah," he said quietly, "maybe. But so did everyone else here today. I'm just the only one who sees it." The leash dragged against the floor as he walked away, not tugging, not forcing. Just moving. Behind him, the shepherd didn't rise, not at first. But when Luke reached the doorway, the dog shifted, stood slowly, and followed, tense, cautious, limping but following. They didn't walk side by side, not yet. There was no tail wag, no joy. Just distance and space between two beings who'd seen too much. But they left together. And maybe that's when it happened. Maybe not in a way anyone could see, but in some quiet, invisible place between them. A thread pulled tight. A bond beginning. Because the truth was, Luke shouldn't have saved that dog. But deep down, beneath all the ash and silence, he knew the dog had already started saving him. The road home was quiet, just like Luke Carter preferred it. Winding through the pines with only the hum of his truck's old engine and the soft, rhythmic sound of the leash clinking against the gear shift. The German shepherd sat in the back seat, perfectly still, not panting, not shaking, not reacting. Just staring out the window like the trees passing by weren't real. Luke had seen that stare before. In firemen who'd pulled too many broken bodies from flames. In mirrors after the night his entire crew was lost in a blaze that moved too fast, too hot, too wrong. He hadn't spoken to his parents in 6 months. Couldn't return calls from his captain. Couldn't even open the letters from the city offering counseling and commendations. He didn't want medals. He wanted sleep. Silence. The cabin he called home wasn't much. 2 rooms, a porch, and a barn that leaned a little more every season. But it was tucked far enough into the woods that the world couldn't reach him. And now, it had one more inhabitant. He didn't force the dog out of the truck when they arrived. Just left the door open, dropped a bowl of water nearby, and went inside. A storm rolled in that night, just thunder and wind, nothing dangerous. But Luke didn't sleep. He watched through the window as the shepherd, still called Zero by default, sat in the gravel driveway, soaked, unbothered by the rain, unmoved by the flashes of lightning. He didn't bark, didn't flinch, just stared into the trees like he expected something worse than thunder to come crawling out of them. The next morning, Luke found him lying against the barn's wall, eyes half open, ribs rising slow. He set down food and water again. The dog didn't move, just watched, like he wasn't sure if this was real or another in a long line of places that promised safety and delivered pain. That afternoon, Luke made a call he hadn't expected to make. "You still doing animal rescues?" he asked. Dr. Riley Monroe was the only vet in the county who didn't flinch when the word aggressive was scribbled on a file. She arrived 2 hours later in a mud-streaked Jeep, boots crunching on gravel, hair tied back in a loose braid, clipboard in hand. She didn't smile when she saw Zero. She sighed. "You got him from the auction?" Luke nodded. "Didn't know what I was doing. Still don't." She crouched a good 10 feet from the shepherd, didn't reach, didn't speak right away. Just studied him with the eyes of someone who'd seen too many dogs put down for things humans had caused. "He's shut down," she said quietly. "Not aggressive. Just gone inside." Luke crossed his arms, watching the dog. He hasn't made a sound. Not even a growl. Riley nodded, never taking her eyes off Zero. "That's not good, Luke. That's not calm. That's trauma. The kind you don't recover from with kibble and kind words." Luke felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. He didn't know why he felt responsible. Maybe because he saw himself in the dog. The silence. The stillness. The way neither of them had reacted when the thunder cracked across the sky. "Can he be helped?" he asked, almost ashamed of how much he needed the answer to be yes. Riley stood slowly, brushing gravel from her knees. "I don't know. I've seen dogs come back from worse. But I've also seen them fade, stop eating, stop responding, stop trying." Her voice dropped, not cruel, just honest. "This dog's been through something most animals, and most people, don't survive. You need to understand that before you commit to this." Luke didn't flinch, didn't argue. He just looked at Zero, and Zero looked right back. No fear, no aggression. Just that haunting emptiness. And something else. The tiniest thread of attention. Of curiosity. Maybe even recognition. "I'm already committed," Luke said softly. "I don't think I had a choice the moment I looked in his eyes." Riley gave a small nod, not of approval, but respect. "Then take it slow. Real slow. Don't try to fix him. Just be there when he decides he wants to come back." She paused, then added, "And for what it's worth, maybe he's not the only one who needs that." With that, she packed up her kit, left behind a few basic meds and a vet's card with her private number on it. Luke stood at the edge of the porch long after she left, watching Zero, who hadn't moved an inch, watch him. And in the thick stillness between them, broken only by wind in the pine trees, something passed again. Not trust. Not yet. But awareness. Two damaged souls, sitting quietly on either side of a wound too deep for words. And neither of them ran. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, not one of healing, but of silent coexistence, like two shadows trying not to disturb the quiet. Zero refused to step foot inside the cabin, no matter how long the door stayed open or how warm the hearth inside crackled. The barn was his refuge. Not because it was safe, but because it was familiar. The wide open loft, the way wind rattled the boards at night, the musty scent of hay and thyme. But even in that space, he never really rested. Luke would find him standing guard more than sleeping, his back to the wall, eyes never truly closed. The food often went untouched unless Luke walked far enough away. Water disappeared slowly, cautiously. Zero didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't whimper. He only watched, like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Luke didn't try to bridge the space between them too quickly. He'd seen what happened when you rushed a fire, how it roared back harder. So he let the days unfold. He took his coffee out to the barn every morning, sat a few feet from the dog, and just talked. Sometimes it was about nothing. How the trees were blooming too early, how the wind always knew when to blow the smoke in your face. Other times, it got heavier, like the fire 2 years ago, the one that swallowed his engine company in a warehouse collapse. Like how he'd been the only one pulled from the rubble, burned but breathing, blinking through smoke and screams that hadn't left his head since. He told stories not for the dog, but maybe for himself. A way to let the memories escape without burning him again. And Zero listened. That's what struck Luke the most. The dog listened better than any therapist ever had. One night, a storm swept through the hills, wind screaming against the roof like it wanted in. Luke sat just inside the barn, the familiar blanket beneath him now soaked through. He didn't speak. He didn't move. The storm was louder than thoughts, louder than fear, louder than the old silence between them. Lightning flared through the slats in the barn walls, and thunder answered like a drum against the bones. Through it all, Zero stood rigid by the far stall, his body trembling just slightly, tail low, head high, fighting to stay present. And then something shifted. Luke didn't see it happen, just realized it was happening. The shepherd, slow as a ghost stepping into light, began walking toward him. One paw, then another, each placement deliberate, uncertain. Luke held his breath. Not out of fear, but reverence. As if any sudden movement might tear the fragile thread hanging between them. The dog stopped a few feet away, ears flicking at the thunder. His body coiled with tension, eyes wary but focused. And then he lay down. Not all at once. He eased into it like a man unlearning how to kneel. Front legs folded, chest low, back legs curled beneath his body. And most important of all, his head settled near Luke's boot. Not touching, but close enough to feel warmth. Luke didn't reach out. He didn't dare. He just sat there, rain dripping down the edge of the roof, hands resting palm up in his lap like he was offering nothing but space. The storm rattled on, but inside that barn, something held still. "You're not alone anymore," Luke whispered, barely audible over the rain. Zero's eyes closed, just briefly, a blink or a breath. But it was enough. That night, for the first time in a long time, neither man nor dog stood watch alone. And when the thunder finally faded into the dark horizon, they remained there, two broken silhouettes beneath a leaky roof, wrapped in silence not of fear, but of understanding. Something had begun, not loud, not sudden, but real. The morning was damp, heavy with the scent of old rain and pine needles. The kind of day where fog hung low and the world felt like it was holding its breath. Luke had gotten into the habit of early walks. Half for Zero, half for himself. The trail behind the cabin cut through woods that had grown wild over the years, paths half-eaten by vines and quiet except for the occasional call of a distant jay. Zero trotted ahead, still quiet, always watching, his steps careful but deliberate. He never strayed too far from Luke, but he didn't walk beside him either, still keeping that silent space between them like it was sacred. They'd been walking for almost an hour when Zero suddenly stopped. His whole body stiffened. His ears pulled back. He growled, not loud, but deep and guttural, a sound that didn't come from fear but memory. Luke followed his gaze to a clearing just ahead, where the outline of an old barn stood in blackened ruin, the wood charred, roof collapsed, beams twisted like broken ribs. It was the neighbor's place, long since abandoned after a fire that, according to the town, had started from an electrical short. Luke had never thought much about it. Fires happened. But something about the way Zero stood, refusing to move, his chest heaving like something inside him was clawing to get out, made Luke step closer. The scent of burned timber still lingered, faint but sharp, like a ghost that hadn't let go. "It's okay, buddy," Luke said quietly, placing a hand near the shepherd's neck without touching. "No one's here." But Zero didn't ease. He stared into the blackened foundation like he was seeing something Luke couldn't. A moment passed, then another, and then, without warning, the dog turned sharply and bolted around the side of the barn. "Zero!" Luke called out, running after him. He found the shepherd pawing at the earth near a corner post, digging not frantically, but with purpose. Luke knelt down beside him, brushing aside the loose soil. That's when he saw it, charred fragments of something unnatural. Melted wiring, bits of accelerant-soaked cloth, a scorched but intact gas cap. His stomach turned. This hadn't been some freak accident. Someone had set this fire. And judging by the way Zero was reacting, snarling now, ears pinned back, it hadn't just been arson. It had been something personal. Luke pulled out his phone, snapped a few photos, and sent a message to the county sheriff's office. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Mathers arrived, boots heavy on the forest floor, eyes squinting at the remains. He listened to Luke's explanation, looked over the evidence, scratched his chin, and shook his head. Could be leftover junk from the cleanup, he said. That place was full of old farm tools. As for the cloth and fuel, might have been there before. Luke tried to protest, but the sheriff raised a hand. Son, I know you've been through some things. And I appreciate your concern. But you're looking for ghosts in smoke. Sometimes, a fire's just a fire. Zero stood behind Luke the entire time, silent but staring at Mathers with unblinking focus. He didn't growl, but his body was rigid, as if holding back something older than fear. As the sheriff turned to leave, he glanced back. You should probably keep that dog leashed, he added casually. Looks like he's seen a few things. Luke waited until the patrol car disappeared down the gravel road before speaking. Yeah, he muttered, looking down at Zero. So have I. They walked back to the cabin in silence, but it wasn't the same silence as before. Something about that place, the way Zero reacted, the way Luke's gut twisted, it felt like a puzzle piece had shifted. That night, Luke sat on the porch, the photos of the burnt debris pulled up on his phone, zooming in on details over and over. Zero lay a few feet away, eyes half closed, but not asleep. Luke looked at him. You knew something was wrong, he said softly. Did they do that to you? Were you there? The dog didn't move, but his tail gave a single twitch. Luke stared out into the dark woods, the fire's memory still smoldering in his head. He didn't know what Zero had been trained for, or how far the scars went, but he was beginning to believe the dog hadn't just survived something awful. He'd remembered it. And in that barn, something had triggered that memory. Not trauma, not fear. A warning, a ghost, yes. But one still walking on four legs, still breathing, still trying to be heard in a world that wasn't listening. Luke promised himself he'd listen better. The next morning brought with it the kind of stillness that made everything feel suspended, like the world itself was listening. Luke stood in the cabin's small office, papers spread across his desk like puzzle pieces that refused to fit. He had driven to the county records department the day before, pretending the files were just for personal curiosity, nothing official. Just trying to understand where this dog came from, he'd said. The clerk, an old-timer with kind eyes and a wariness of government bureaucracy, slid him a manila folder thick with faded photocopies and incident logs. He's got a working number tattooed in his ear, Luke had explained, tapping his phone. Former municipal K9, looks like. The man didn't argue, just handed over what he could. Now, as morning sunlight filtered through dusty blinds, Luke read through the fragmented records again and again. The name Zero was stamped in multiple reports, but that wasn't his real designation. The first file listed him as Ash 7, part of the fire department Urban K9 search unit, a highly specialized rescue team deployed during building collapses and post-blaze sweeps. There were commendations, rescues pulled from basements, children found under rubble, even an instance where he reportedly led a trapped firefighter to safety just seconds before a floor gave way. But then, the tone of the records changed. Abruptly, 6 months before he ended up at that auction, there was an incident. The words were clinical, detached. Handler incapacitated. Canine behavior classified as unpredictable. Transferred to behavioral assessment facility. Considered for decommissioning. No details. No photos. The report ended mid-sentence. Luke flipped to the next page, blacked out. Redacted. Half the text gone under thick black ink lines. Whole paragraphs vanished. What was left felt more like an accusation than a report. K9 failed to comply with evacuation order. Potential cause of further injury. Luke's hands tightened on the edge of the desk. He knew what that language meant. It was how the system covered its failures. Dress betrayal in red tape, and it would walk right past accountability without ever being seen. He didn't need the details to see the truth. The dog had been blamed, written off, tossed into silence like garbage after service. Just like him, his own fire report had used words like reckless decision, failure to communicate. Never mind that the radio had failed. Never mind that his captain had given the order to go back in. They needed someone to pin the disaster on, and Luke was the one left breathing. They called it administrative leave. They called it under review. But it was a sentence all the same. And now here he was, staring at the same kind of bureaucratic betrayal, but in the form of a dog with haunted eyes and a name no one had cared enough to remember. Luke looked over at Zero, who lay curled by the cabin's back door, eyes open, body relaxed but alert. Not asleep. Never fully asleep. You got blamed too, huh? Luke said quietly. They broke you, then turned their backs when you didn't come back perfect. The dog's ears twitched. That was all. But it was enough. Luke picked up the redacted file again and shook his head. There were initials on one of the sign-off pages, DSNGP. No names. No titles. Just signatures buried under government stamps. Someone didn't want this dog's story getting out. Someone had buried him. But Zero had survived anyway. And now he was here, scared, silent, but alive. You ever wish you hadn't made it out? Luke asked, not expecting an answer. I do. Some nights, when it gets quiet enough, I think maybe they were the lucky ones. The words hung in the room like smoke. Luke wasn't sure who he was speaking to anymore, Zero, himself, or the ghosts of the crew that never walked out of that warehouse. He sank into the old chair, papers scattered around him, anger boiling slow and steady in his chest. Not the kind that flared and burned, but the kind that simmered, controlled, coiled, and waiting. They did this to you, he whispered, looking down at the shredded documents. And they're still hiding it. He thought of the sheriff shrugging off the evidence. Thought of the burn site, the metal fragments, the gas cap buried under dirt like a secret grave. Something was being erased, buried in layers of silence and procedural garbage. And Zero, this broken, loyal, battle-scarred soul, had been left to rot in it. Not anymore. Luke stood, gathering the files. He didn't know what he was going to do next, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The truth wasn't going to stay buried. Not if he could help it. And if anyone tried to come for this dog again, they'd have to come through him. It happened just after midnight, the kind of hour where dreams are deepest and the world outside the cabin is so still, even the wind holds its breath. Luke had finally fallen asleep on the couch, exhaustion wrapping around him like a weighted blanket after days of restless nights. The fire in the hearth had died down to embers, casting faint orange pulses against the log walls. Then it came, sharp, loud, and utterly alive. A bark. Not a whimper. Not a growl. A full-throated bark that shook the stillness like a gunshot. Luke jolted upright, heart pounding, eyes wide and disoriented. Zero was at the window, tail rigid, ears forward, teeth bared in a snarl Luke had never seen from him before. The dog barked again, short, clipped bursts, then darted toward the back door. Luke was on his feet instantly, grabbing the flashlight and his boots, adrenaline flooding his veins like it hadn't in years. He followed Zero out into the night, the cold slapping him fully awake. The barn sat in shadow, just a few feet from the edge of the woods, but it wasn't the barn that had Zero's attention. It was the detached garage, the one where Luke kept his gear, the rescued files, and everything he hadn't had the strength to throw away. The side door was open. And inside, movement. Luke's breath caught as he crouched behind the firewood stack, Zero at his side, utterly silent now, locked in like a missile. A figure moved across the garage interior, flashlight bouncing over shelves, someone searching, but not for tools. Luke watched in disbelief as the intruder went straight for the drawer where he kept the folder on Zero's history. Another shape appeared behind him, two men. Working fast. Too fast. They knew where to go, Luke whispered, more to himself than to the dog. But Zero heard him, ears tilting back just slightly. Then he tensed, a low vibration rumbling from his chest. And without waiting for a command, he was gone. A blur of shadow and motion as he surged forward, paws pounding the gravel with a force Luke hadn't seen before. The intruders didn't even have time to scream. The first man dropped his flashlight as Zero slammed into him, teeth bared, jaws locked onto the man's sleeve just inches from his wrist. He didn't maul, he contained. Trimmed. Focused. The second man bolted, disappearing into the trees, but Luke was already on the phone, voice steady despite the tremor in his limbs. "This is Luke Carter," he told the 911 dispatcher. "I've got a break-in at my property." "Not sure. But I've got one detained. My dog's got him, yeah, he's trained. XK9. Hurry." Within minutes, the place was crawling with red and blue lights. The sheriff's deputies arrived first, guns drawn, but lowered them the moment they saw Zero holding his position beside the trembling intruder, a shredded jacket sleeve the only casualty. Luke called him off, a single low word, "Enough." And just like that, the shepherd backed away, sitting by Luke's feet, eyes still locked on the man like a judge waiting to pass sentence. The deputy cuffed the guy while another searched the garage. They knew what they were looking for, Luke explained, motioning toward the scattered files. They went straight for the folder, Zero's records, the burned barn photos. Nothing else touched. The sheriff arrived 10 minutes later, visibly rattled as he stepped out of his truck and looked at the scene. "What the hell's going on out here, Luke?" Luke didn't answer right away. He was watching Zero. The dog wasn't pacing, wasn't growling. He was calm, like a switch had flipped, like he had remembered who he was. "He's not just a dog," Luke said finally, eyes still fixed on the shepherd. "He's a soldier." And tonight he sniffed out the truth. They brought the intruder to the cruiser, and under pressure, he cracked faster than anyone expected. He wasn't a local. He worked for a private security company, one Luke had never heard of. But the badge on his duffel bag, recovered during the search, bore a name that stopped Luke cold: Pratex Risk Solutions, a national arson investigation and prevention firm with ties to multiple municipalities. When Luke looked it up later, the surface-level website listed fancy corporate buzzwords: fire mitigation, post-blaze consultation, government contracts. But dig deeper, and forums lit up with whispers of something darker. "Cover-up crew," one anonymous post read. "They show up after suspicious fires. Quiet things down. Make the truth disappear." Luke sat in silence as the cruiser drove away with the man. Zero lay beside him on the porch, his breathing steady, but his eyes still alert, tracking every movement like a guardian. The files were salvaged. The rest was just mess, scattered papers, a busted lock, adrenaline still draining from Luke's veins. But something had shifted. Permanently. The dog who once refused to even eat with a human nearby had just chased down a threat, protected what mattered, and returned to Luke's side like it was second nature. Like the warrior buried inside him had finally remembered how to stand. Luke reached down, his hand hovering above Zero's head, uncertain for a moment, then letting it fall gently. Zero didn't flinch. He leaned into it. And in that quiet, Luke felt something bloom: relief, gratitude, and maybe even pride. This wasn't obedience. It wasn't training. It was choice. The dog had chosen to fight, to protect, to believe. Later that night, as they sat beside the fire, Luke reread the redacted report that had labeled Zero unstable, unpredictable, unsuitable for field deployment. And he laughed, a bitter, breathless sound that faded into the warmth of the room. "They got it wrong," he said, scratching behind Zero's ear. "They didn't understand you at all." Zero closed his eyes, tail thumping once. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like an old hymn. But inside that cabin, in the flickering firelight, sat two beings who had been blamed, broken, and betrayed, now whole only because they had found each other. And for the first time since the fire, Luke didn't feel like a man barely surviving. He felt like part of a team. A real one. One forged not in uniform, but in scars. And he knew, whatever was coming, whatever secrets were still buried, he wouldn't be facing it alone. It was supposed to be a routine checkup, just a follow-up visit with Dr. Riley Monroe to make sure Zero hadn't strained anything during the break-in. The vet clinic smelled of antiseptic and lavender, a strange mix of clinical and comforting. Zero sat on the steel table, calm but alert, his eyes following every movement Riley made as she gently ran her fingers along his spine. She worked in silence, her brows furrowed, not from concern, but concentration, like she was chasing a ghost under his skin. "You've been through hell," she murmured to him, barely loud enough for Luke to hear. He stood nearby, arms crossed, trying not to pace. Then Riley paused, her hand stopping near Zero's left flank. Her fingers brushed gently over a patch of fur that looked no different from the rest. She parted the coat with practiced care, and what she found made her face go still. Beneath the fur, hidden like a cruel secret, was a patch of scarred, uneven skin. Not a wound. A healed-over burn. She said nothing at first. Just moved her hand a few inches over. Another scar. And another. "Riley?" Luke asked, his voice low, afraid of the answer. She looked up at him, her face tight. "These aren't from fire debris," she said. "They're too small. Too deliberate. Controlled. This wasn't an accident." She turned back to Zero, gently stroking between his ears. "Someone did this to him. On purpose." The air shifted, heavy with something unspoken. Luke stepped forward, his heart pounding, memories rising in his chest like smoke, ash, collapsed beams, screams and radios. He reached out, resting his hand near one of the scars. "Why would anyone do that to a rescue dog?" he whispered. Riley swallowed hard. "It's not just cruelty. It's targeted. Like someone wanted to recondition him. Or silence him." Silence. That word sat between them like a weight. Suddenly, it all made sense. Zero's refusal to bark, his flinch-free reaction to thunder, his unnatural stillness. Not fear. Conditioning. Like a soldier trained to suppress instinct. "He wasn't damaged," Luke said slowly, the truth unraveling in his voice. "He was silenced." Riley nodded once. "And whoever did this didn't want anyone finding out." Luke's fists clenched. The files. The redactions. The midnight break-in. It wasn't random. Someone had worked hard to erase this dog's past, to bury not just his record, but his voice. The burn marks weren't just proof of pain, they were evidence. Luke didn't say much on the drive back. Zero sat in the back seat, his eyes calm, as if he somehow knew the truth was finally being seen. But inside Luke, something was boiling. This wasn't just about healing anymore. This was about justice. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had begun to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the gravel. Luke didn't turn on the lights. He walked straight to the folder, spread the files out again, and stared at them until the sun was gone. Riley's voice echoed in his head. Someone wanted to silence him. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the fireplace, laptop open, typing search queries into forums, deep records, fire department union logs, anything. He pulled up satellite maps of the old fire site, compared them with Zero's last logged rescue locations. then cross-referenced every incident with private fire contractors. One name kept resurfacing. Not loud, not obvious, but woven into cleanup rosters, investigation summaries, and post-disaster consulting gigs. Pratex Risk Solutions. Luke leaned back, eyes burning, heart racing. They hadn't just covered up arson, they had rewritten the aftermath. And Zero had seen something, remembered something, been punished for something. Luke looked over at the shepherd curled by the door, his breathing slow, peaceful. "They thought you wouldn't survive," he whispered. "They thought you'd disappear like a ghost in a fire." His voice trembled. "But you're still here." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with resolve. For the first time, Luke felt not just anger, but purpose. They hadn't just betrayed the dog. They tried to erase a soldier. And Luke Carter wasn't going to let them succeed. The rain came down in slow sheets as Luke and Riley stood outside the charred remains of what once was a low-income apartment complex on the edge of the city. Grass had grown wild around the fence line, and plywood covered most of the blackened window frames like forgotten bandages over wounds too deep to heal. This was where it had all begun, the fire that ended Zero's career, the one buried in redacted reports and silence. Luke had found the address buried in an old incident log linked to Zero's last recorded deployment, filed under a generic code. Unit 7K9 dispatch, structure collapse, 3 fatalities. No follow-up, no memorial, just another number in the system. Riley walked beside him, her steps slow, her eyes scanning the scene with the quiet focus of someone trained to see what others overlook. "They never rebuilt," she said softly. Luke nodded. "No insurance payout. Investigation ended in less than a week." He had read the report a dozen times. It was thin, rushed, and riddled with contradictions. The blaze had started in a maintenance closet, they claimed. Electrical. Faulty fuse box. But witnesses reported the smell of gasoline. And the ones who pushed for answers? Their statements were conveniently misfiled or never recorded at all. Luke clenched his jaw. 3 people died. But nobody seemed to care. Riley pointed to a burned metal plaque barely visible under ivy. "That's because someone made sure they didn't." A few blocks away, in a modest row house with weathered siding and plastic flowers on the porch, lived Ana Morales, the only known survivor of the fire. She was 10 when the blaze happened, and now 16, tall and quiet with eyes that had seen too much. Her grandmother opened the door and waved them in. The living room was filled with photos, school awards, and drawings pinned to walls that vibrated with life in a place where death had once hovered far too close. Ana sat on the edge of the couch, holding a mug of tea she didn't drink, her gaze fixed on Zero. He sat calmly by the door, watching her with that still, solemn intensity. "That's him," she whispered after a moment. "He's the one who pulled me out." Luke leaned forward, his voice low. "You remember that?" She nodded. "I was trapped under part of the hallway. Couldn't move. There was smoke everywhere, and then I felt fur. Breathing. He didn't bark. He just stayed beside me until someone found us." Her voice cracked. He was calm. Like he knew I was scared. He didn't leave. Riley glanced at Luke. Ana went on, her hands shaking slightly. "After they got me out, I saw 2 men put him in a van. He didn't fight. Didn't make a sound. I thought they were taking him to help someone else." She looked up, her eyes shining. But they looked scared. Like he knew something he wasn't supposed to. Luke sat in stunned silence. Every instinct told him this girl was telling the truth. Not just about Zero saving her, but about the part no one had dared to write down. "Do you remember the men?" Riley asked gently. Ana nodded again. "They wore jackets with a red symbol. A triangle inside a circle." Luke froze. That was the symbol on the Pratex duffel bag he'd found during the break-in. Everything clicked. Zero hadn't been removed because he failed. He was silenced because he succeeded. Because in the chaos of that fire, he had seen something, smelled something, witnessed the truth. The fire wasn't an accident. It was arson, and someone powerful had buried it. Luke's hands trembled slightly as he stood. "Thank you, Anna. You just gave us the piece we were missing." She nodded, then looked at Zero again. "He didn't bark that day, but I heard him. Somehow I still did." Outside, the sky had turned a deep gray, the kind that felt like the calm before another storm. Luke looked at Riley. "They buried 3 bodies. And buried him with them." She nodded slowly. "But he made it out." Luke looked down at Zero, who met his gaze with calm, unflinching clarity. "Yeah," he said softly. "And now it's our turn to dig everything else back up." It started with a note. No name. No return address. Just a single sheet of paper slid under Luke's cabin door sometime during the night. The message was typed, clean, cold. "Stop digging. Let sleeping dogs lie." Luke stared at it for a long time, fingers trembling slightly, a slow burn rising in his chest. Not fear, but something else. Resolve. He left it on the table, unbothered on the surface, but inside, alarms were ringing. Zero, as if sensing the shift, never left his side that day. He sat by the window longer than usual. Refused food. Ears flicking at every sound beyond the trees. Riley offered to come by, but Luke told her not to. "Too risky," he said. He spent the evening going over files again, trying to piece together the last names, missing reports, falsified signatures. Midnight crept in quiet and thick, the forest outside silent as a secret. That's when the first snap came, a sharp crack of something behind the house. Zero launched off the floor before Luke even registered the sound. The dog growled, low and guttural, and that's when Luke smelled it, gasoline. His body moved before thought caught up. He ran to the back door, flung it open, and fire surged upward from the base of the porch. Someone had doused the support beams. Flames licked the cabin like hungry tongues, wrapping around the logs, turning dry pine into kindling in seconds. Smoke surged in with terrifying speed. Luke turned to run, but the flashover hit hard, an explosion of heat and force that knocked him backward. He crashed into the wooden floor, the room spinning, lungs already burning. Somewhere in the chaos, he heard a bark, not scared, not confused. Commanding. Then felt teeth, gentle but firm, at his collar. Dragging him, inch by inch, through fire, through smoke, through the blinding orange haze. Luke couldn't see, couldn't move, could barely breathe, but he felt the pull, the strength, the unwavering grip of a dog who had once saved strangers from collapsing buildings, now saving the one man who had listened when no one else had. The front door gave way as they tumbled through, smoke chasing them like a ghost. Luke gasped air, cold, wet air as sprinklers from the nearby trees kicked on from heat sensors. Zero barked again, circling, making sure he was awake, alive, conscious. Neighbors saw the flames from a mile away. The sirens came next. Riley's voice broke through the noise, screaming his name. Firefighters dragged hoses through the brush, fighting a blaze that had been set with professional precision. Arson. No question. Luke sat wrapped in a blanket, coughing, lungs raw but functional. Zero sat beside him, his fur singed, one paw slightly burned, but alive. Unyielding. "He pulled me out," Luke rasped, pointing at the shepherd. "He saved my life." The fire chief nodded, eyes narrowed. "Dog like that? That's no ordinary mutt." By morning, the local news was at the edge of the woods. A burned veteran and his ex-K9 partner targeted for uncovering corruption, Small-town media couldn't look away. Interviews began. Riley spoke to reporters about the scars, the redacted files, the pattern of fires that never made it past routine cause. Luke said little, but what he did say mattered. Someone tried to erase him, but they failed. He didn't just survive, he remembered. People listened. People cared. What started as whispers became shouts. Articles. Shares. Support. Strangers showed up with food. Kids drew pictures of Zero. A firefighter from another state sent a plaque. Service never ends. Loyalty never dies. Luke taped it on the garage wall, the only building still standing. The rest, his home, his records, his past, had been burned again. But this time, it didn't end in silence. Because this time, the dog made it out. And this time, so did the truth. The courthouse was packed. Local reporters shoulder to shoulder with townsfolk who had followed the story like a flame carried from one heart to another. What started as a whisper in the woods had become a roar of reckoning, and at its center stood two survivors. A broken man who had once walked alone, and the silent K9 who had refused to be erased. Luke adjusted his tie, one borrowed from Riley, who stood near the entrance, nodding gently. Zero lay by his feet, calm and alert, wearing a clean red collar and a new vest marked with bold white letters. Former Rescue K9, Honored Service. The judge glanced at him more than once, not in amusement, but in reverence, as if even the court recognized that justice today wasn't just for the living, but for those who'd been buried in ashes long ago. The trial had taken weeks. Luke testified first, his voice steady, his memories sharp. He told them about the night of the fire, the files, the scars on Zero's body, the suppressed records. He talked about the silence, the kind that kills louder than flames. He spoke not just of what had been done, but what had been ignored. Riley followed, presenting evidence, forensic scans of old wounds, conflicting timelines in incident reports, and the fire that had nearly taken Luke's life. The moment that tipped the scales came when Ana Morales, now standing tall and fierce at 17, took the stand and told the courtroom exactly what she remembered. How the dog didn't leave her side, how two men took him away that night, how their jackets bore a red symbol she never forgot. Pratex Risk Solutions collapsed within a week. The developers behind the apartment blaze, wealthy investors with city contracts, were named in leaked memos recovered from a whistleblower. Their goal: clear the property for commercial expansion. The fire inspector who signed off on the faulty wiring explanation? Indicted. The silence they had wrapped around Zero's story unraveled one lie at a time. But the moment that lived longer than all the legal fireworks came on the final day, when the judge called Luke back to the witness stand, not for cross-examination, but for closure. Luke stepped forward slowly. He wasn't nervous. Not anymore. His voice rang clear. I used to think I was cursed to be the one who survived. That maybe I didn't deserve to make it out when others didn't. But this dog, this soldier, reminded me that surviving isn't the same as being broken. It's a beginning, a chance to tell the truth that others didn't get to tell. He paused, looked down at Zero. The shepherd met his gaze, still and proud. He didn't just save lives. He remembered them. And when the world tried to forget, he carried the truth in his bones until someone finally listened. The room was quiet. Some people wiped tears. Even the bailiff looked away to compose himself. We all have scars, Luke added. Some visible, some hidden. But healing doesn't come from pretending we're fine. It comes from standing up, together, and saying enough. As he stepped down, applause broke out. Not wild, not performative. Just honest, grateful, respectful. In the hallway outside, people lined up to shake his hand. Children knelt beside Zero, offering treats, drawing hearts with chalk on the courthouse steps. One older man, a retired firefighter, pressed a coin into Luke's hand. Medal of Valor, he whispered. Should have been yours. But now it's his. Luke looked down at the tarnished coin, then at Zero. He wouldn't want a medal, he said. Just a quiet place to sleep. And someone to stand beside. And from that moment forward, that's exactly what he had. It was a clear autumn afternoon when the town gathered at the newly unveiled memorial park, a gentle breeze rustling through the golden leaves as children laughed near a fountain shaped like a firefighter's helmet. At the center of the space stood a bronze statue, life-sized, dignified, timeless. A German shepherd seated tall, alert, eyes cast forward. The plaque beneath it read, "Zero, loyalty in flames, truth in silence." Around it, the names of fallen firefighters spiraled outward like a constellation of sacrifice, etched into stone so no one would ever forget again. Luke stood near the front, wearing a dark suit, his hand resting on Zero's back as the crowd hushed. The fire department's chief, once skeptical, now reverent, stepped forward, his voice catching as he unfolded a red velvet box. For service above and beyond the call of duty. 4 lives saved and truth defended. We hereby reinstate K9 Unit Ash 7. Call name 0 with full honors and distinction. He opened the box to reveal a gleaming service medal. The moment the medal was fastened to Zero's vest, the crowd rose to its feet in solemn applause, not for show, but for reverence. It wasn't just a correction. It was redemption. Riley stood off to the side, eyes glistening, her hand clutching Anna's, who now worked part-time at the clinic, inspired by the rescue that once saved her life. The town mayor took the podium next and announced that the fields surrounding the park would be preserved in honor of all first responders, both human and canine. This ground is hallowed, she said, not because of a tragedy, but because of what came after. Healing, truth, hope. And then it was Luke's turn. He stepped up, cleared his throat, and looked out over the crowd. Neighbors, strangers, survivors, friends. Zero stood beside him, calm, dignified, his eyes on the horizon. Luke's voice was soft but sure. "We both lost everything," he began. "I lost my brothers in a fire I wasn't supposed to survive. He lost his pack in a system that didn't protect him. We were discarded, broken, told to forget. But somehow, through pain, through silence, we found each other." He paused, letting the wind carry the weight of that truth. "Zero didn't save me once. He saved me every day after. He taught me how to breathe again, how to trust, how to remember without drowning in it." Murmurs of emotion swept through the crowd. "They tried to erase him," Luke continued. "But you can't erase loyalty. You can't silence a soul built to serve. And when the world finally listened, we didn't just find justice. We found our way back." His voice broke then, just slightly. But he didn't stop. "This statue isn't just for Zero. It's for every firefighter who never came home. Every rescue dog who was thrown away when they stopped being useful. It's for anyone who's ever been broken by a system that forgot they were human or loyal." He stepped down, and the air was thick with stillness, the kind that lives only in places where healing has happened. Zero followed him, his paw steps light but deliberate, his body now bearing not just scars, but honors. Later, as the sun dipped low behind the trees and the lights in the memorial garden flickered on like stars, Luke sat on a bench beside the statue, hand resting gently on Zero's shoulder. "We made it, buddy," he whispered. "They see you now. The real you." Zero didn't move, didn't bark, but the way he leaned into Luke's touch said everything that needed to be said. And for the first time in years, Luke Carter felt whole. The morning came slow and gold, the kind of sunrise that felt less like light and more like grace unfolding. Luke sat on the old wooden porch, the same one that had once been licked by flames, now rebuilt stronger, steadier, just like the man who rested upon it. a warm cup of coffee cradled in his hands, the steam curling up into the crisp autumn air. Beside him, stretched out with his chin resting lightly on Luke's boot, lay the dog once known as Zero, now renamed Valor by unanimous vote from the fire department, the town, and the very people he had silently saved. The name fit like destiny. Valor had earned every letter of it. His eyes were half closed, chest rising and falling in slow, even breaths, the scars beneath his fur now barely visible, no longer defining him, only reminding. Luke took another sip, the silence between them full, not empty. The kind of silence that only exists between souls who've walked through fire together and come out whole. The mountains were awash in soft light, the leaves touched by orange and amber as the sun lifted the sky higher, and Luke found himself smiling, not wide, not for show, but a quiet, knowing kind of smile. "You came to save me," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the wind. "I just didn't know I needed saving." Valor's ears twitched at the sound, but he didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence was enough, a steady heartbeat in a world that had once felt like it might never be safe again. Luke's thoughts drifted, not to the courtroom or the fire, or even the past, but to the porch itself. This porch had seen two broken beings meet for the first time. It had held silent meals, tentative trust, barks in the night, and eventual laughter. It had become a witness to healing. And now it bore the weight of peace. Luke reached down, his hand brushing against Valor's head, fingers running along the edges of one ear that had always drooped just slightly to the left. Valor stirred only slightly, then shifted, laying his head directly in Luke's lap, eyes closed, completely at ease. Luke exhaled, the kind of breath that only comes when the world has finally stopped demanding something from you. The sun crept higher, and for the first time in years, there was no tension in his shoulders, no ghosts in the corner of his vision, no guilt clinging to the edges of his thoughts. Just morning, just peace, just a man and his dog who had saved each other. There would be other days, speeches, visitors, maybe even books written about them, but none would matter more than this one. Because this was the day they didn't have to fight anymore. This was the day they simply were. Man-dog. Survivor. Soldier. Luke looked out over the land that had once burned, now covered in wildflowers and soft grass, and whispered one last thing. "We made it, boy. You're safe now." Valor didn't respond. He didn't need to. His head rose and fell with the rhythm of trust. And in that stillness, as the sky turned to full light and the world stirred awake, a man and his dog sat bathed in the first true morning of the rest of their lives. The world didn't end with fire, it ended in silence. And that's where healing began. On a quiet morning not long after the trial, Luke sat on the porch with Valor beside him, the two of them watching the wind move softly through the trees as if the world had finally exhaled. The scars they carried were still there, some visible, some buried deep, but they no longer controlled the narrative. And as the camera slowly pulls back, the voiceover begins. Not dramatic, but intimate, the kind of voice you lean into without realizing. Dogs like Valor don't just serve us. They reveal us. The words float over scenes of quiet honor, memorials with paw prints carved in stone, firefighters laying helmets down beside folded flags, a little girl drawing a picture of a shepherd under the words, "Thank you." Luke's voice continues, gentle and steady. They remind us of who we are when the noise fades, when the smoke clears, and all that's left is loyalty and breath. Valor rests his head on Luke's lap as the sun rises higher, soft golden light brushing his fur. "This dog didn't just save my life, he gave me one," Luke says. The screen fades into black and white tribute photos. Real K9s, firefighters, their names etched with dignity. There are hundreds like him, the voice says, working in silence, saving in shadows. Some we honor, some we forget. but all of them deserve to be seen. A slow piano melody swells. To every first responder who carries the weight of memories they can't share. To every K9 who's been left behind. To every soul who's been told they're broken beyond repair, this story is for you. The screen fades to black. One last line echoes out before silence. He didn't just save me. He reminded me I was worth saving. Then only the sound of wind, a head resting peacefully on a lap, and the slow, steady light of a new day.